Close enough? Yes.
Yes.
I am Sandy Kurtz. It's K-U-R-T-Z. And I am a environmental education consultant, but I'm here as a volunteer for Bellefonte Efficiency and Sustainability Team and Mothers Against Tennessee River Radiation, and we are chapters of the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League, and I serve on that board as well. We have a long list of concerns and reasons why we think that this should not, the relicensing should not happen, and so we certainly want these to be reviewed and considered during this supplemental environmental impact statement review, the scoping session here. The original environmental impact statement was done when the plant was first opened. That's 1980s, and it seems like it's time to really start from scratch, not just say that there's been no significant environmental impact at this point, because it's been operating for all this time, and gosh, we haven't really had an accident yet, so we can just rely on that same environmental impact statement, and we can say that it's going to be the same way for the next 20 years. 20 years starting in 2020, because that's when the first license expires. I know there was one extension in between. So it's questionable to think that there's going to be no significant environmental impacts in the future just because, and I don't think it's even reasonable to say there's been no significant environmental impacts, but in the past 32 years, but still, that's what NRC is saying. So I think that we need to really begin from scratch again on that. Aging is a real issue here. We have an old plant. It's been operating with poor technology, outdated technology now, the ice condenser design, which you all know is a bunch of ice baskets to cool off in case of an accident. It's going to cool off the containment building, or the reactor itself, and that's old. And furthermore, there's always concrete decay. There's pipes that are broken, that are leaking, and I know TVA will say, well, we've been replacing these parts, and I know they just put in a new steam generator, but there are parts you can't get to. They're buried in concrete. You don't know when they're going to leak. You don't know what's happening, and they are aging. And I think that's a very big concern, to think that we are going to give a license to continue on for 20 years without worrying a lot about that aging situation. There's concern over flooding. In the light of lessons learned from Fukushima, and the fact that TVA has discovered with their own calculations that they are they're too low. They need to put in flood protection in case the earthen dams upstream give way. And that certainly is an analysis that has to be done to assess the risk to a growing urban population. When Sequoyah was first built, it was pretty rural out here, and now it isn't. And so we have a growing population, and I think we need to assess the risk should those dams upstream break or an earthquake occur, because we now also find out that we live in a possibly seismically active area. We had the Knoxville earthquake recently, and in and around Knoxville, and just was it today? The lady here was telling me we had a small earthquake here in this area just today. So I think we need to figure out if the design for Sequoyah is strong enough to withstand a heavy earthquake, and I understand that magnitude 5 would be a good number to shoot for protecting. It's also, I'm especially concerned about water use. And we have climate disruption. more storms, more problems that way, and we also have growing industry, business, people that use the water in addition to the drinking water, most of which comes from the Tennessee River, for Chattanooga. And a nuclear plant uses if it's a 1,000 megawatt, and Sequoyah is a little bigger, 714,740 gallons per minute. So I'm concerned about the use of that water, two-thirds of which does not go back into the river after it's used to cool. The rest of it is hot, and so we worry about the fish and the aquatic community there in that whole ecosystem. Where was I? I was talking to you earlier about the water usage and how much water comes out of the river every minute. 714,740 gallons per minute when the plant is operating, and two-thirds of that goes up into the air through the cooling towers that we're also familiar with. And the rest goes back into the river, and it's hot. There are regulations about how hot it can be, but it is hot, and it goes back into the river and affects the fish, although, as I've been told, fish can swim around the hot parts. But there are other macroinvertebrates and small critters in the water that are called the drift community, and they cannot swim around. They are subject to whatever they run into. So that's a problem, and in fact, it's water that's going to be the constraining resource in the future. We cannot have nuclear plants using all that water that could be used for other uses, and it's just evaporating into the air for the most part, and that also causes climate change, climate disruptions as well. So I think we need to, I think that we are going to have continued drought conditions in between storms if the predictions are correct about that. And we are also going to have hotter water, and that has caused some shutdowns of nuclear plants already here in the Tennessee Valley. I know Sequoyah and Wattsville are both shut down because the water in the river was too hot to take the hot water that the nuclear plants were putting into it. So those shutdowns that are caused by climate should be a significant environmental impact and should be considered as one of the possible things to analyze as to how that's going to work. Further shutdowns, every time there's a shutdown, that is really, really expensive. That costs a lot for TVA to be operating shutdown, and they have planned shutdowns, but every time there's a scram, that's an emergency shutdown. And by the way, Sequoyah has been cited by NRC for having too many of these emergency shutdowns in a year. I think that happened last year. So, that is a problem. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the extension of the license. Apparently, TVA, well, I know TVA has already entered into an agreement with Department of Energy to produce tritium until 2035. And tritium is a radioactive form of hydrogen that becomes a radioactive form of water. If it's ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin, tritium can permeate living cells and cause damage at the cellular level. So in both 2003 and in 2011, tritium was found in the groundwater at Sequoyah. It's also leaking from the Watts Bar 1 where they're making, because the absorbed with the rod cladding. It's being absorbed into the rod cladding, and then it's leaking into the river. So, since we get our drinking water primarily from the Tennessee River, downstream from Watts Bar and Sequoyah, we've been exposed to that for these what will be 40 years when the license expires, and I don't think we need another 20 years of that just so the Department of Energy can have tritium made in a commercial, supposedly a commercial nuclear plant, and they're using it for military use because, as you all know, surely tritium is used to boost military bombs, making of bombs, and it's used for that purpose. And so the Department of Energy wants them, but I don't think we should be supporting the making of bombs while we're poisoning our water. The other issue too is about radioactive mixed oxide fuel. That's another thing the Department of Energy wants TVA to be using here. It's experimental in commercial nuclear plants, never been used in the United States in a commercial nuclear plant, and our Sequoyah is not designed for it. So to say that for TVA to agree to that, to using that mixed oxide fuel that's so radioactive, more so than plain old uranium, I don't think we should think about that. And that too, of course, would be a significant environmental impact if that leaks out, gets loose, or we have an accident. Spent fuel storage. You know what spent fuel is? Radioactive fuel, that uranium that has been used in the reactor, and then it becomes actually more radioactive, and it is taken out of the reactor and put into this fuel pool. And the rods where the uranium fuel is, this highly radioactive rods, are put into the fuel pool, and what's happening is that it's getting more and more crowded because they don't know what to do with the waste. Where shall we put the radioactive waste, since there's no place to ship it to? There's no setup for that. And besides, why have two places that are radioactive when you can just leave it on site here at Sequoyah? But how much more should we be making? So the crowding of the rods is a problem. And when they take the rod density, there's more opportunity for accidents when the rods are so much closer together, and fission can happen. So where do we put it? These are the things that I think that the scoping should include. Where are we going to put those rods and keep the crowding smaller? And is the Watts Bar radioactive waste also going to be supported to Sequoyah, which has, I think, is true? And has the proposed independent spent fuel storage building been put in place, and is it secure enough? Further, are there plans to put things into a hardened cask storage so that they are safer than they are in the fuel pool? I know that Gretel had just spoken about the decommissioning plans and the fact that there are only two alternatives mentioned, both of which either say decommission, and we would recommend that, and build a new, but their alternative also says if you want to build a new 40-year licensed nuclear plant, but you can't do it on the Sequoyah nuclear site. It's already poisoned, actually. So that doesn't sound like a good plan. We wouldn't recommend any more nuclear plants. The other is the gas-fired generators to replace Sequoyah nuclear plant, but again, not on the Sequoyah nuclear plant site, because it's sort of no man's land when you get a nuclear plant. People can't go there again. It's kind of like a land grab, it seems to me, kind of giving away your land, which can never be entered again, because it always, even in decommissioning, because it always has to be protected from the radiation. So you're giving away land to think about having nuclear plants. But if they're going to be decommissioned, it has to be certainly safe too. There are alternatives, and I too would suggest that NRC consider other alternatives besides just those two. I'm going to talk about radiation doses. When you have, NRC has radiation doses, they have established standards, and those standards for radiation tell all the nuclear plants what level of dosages are okay, in their opinion, okay for you to receive. Some small amount that they consider absolutely safe, and below that, there's no problem. And that's how they figure out what the dosage is going to be, and how they say there's no public risk. But we all know that there is no safe dose of radiation because it's cumulative. I'll do the rest of the evening.
STULCE, employed by the city of Saudi Daisy at present. I have been associated with the city either through the volunteer fire department since 1972 until present. I served on the city council for 4 years, 2 years which I was mayor. The comments that I'm going to make are qualified to the point of from direct experience. Sequoyah nuclear plant, and this is unsolicited by anybody there, and I have a number of friends that work there, as you would expect in any small community. Our town in this region has benefited from this facility, not only from a financial standpoint as to a standard of living that it provides for the people who reside here, but as far as the valley as a whole of the southeastern United States has directly benefited from all of the endeavors of the Tennessee Valley Authority since the 1930s. And to that case in point, there are dams that were built in the 30s that still don't have any problems today. Everything at Sequoyah nuclear plant that I have been affiliated with as either a representative of the city or as a firefighter or through city government has been totally open, totally above board. There have never been any secrets. I was in the facility during its construction, flew over it in the late 60s when they were digging the holes out in the rock underneath the ground cover. It's a magnificent facility. I have no concerns as far as the tight neighbor that Sequoyah nuclear plant has always been as far as safety. Yes, in any industry that is fairly new, and the nuclear industry starting in the 50s, yes, it's an old design. It's a well-proven design. I think I'm correct if I say that Sequoyah has broken the majority of the records in the United States for sustained power production and efficiency, even though it is a branch of the federal government to that extent, which is often identified with waste. It leads the industry in the reliability and sustainability of the power that it produces. And I would like to go on record not only as a citizen of this area, lifelong resident, but I speak, I think, for the entire City Council and the vast majority of residents who reside in this area who would be affected in a negative aspect were there a problem there. That we trust TVA, we trust their decisions, and the fact that they have always kept us in the loop in any situation, whether it be good or bad, and that we wholeheartedly support their request for a licensing extension of the plant. Thank you.
Don Safer from Nashville with the Tennessee Environmental Council State Sierra Club. I want to raise specific issues in the first 5 minutes, and I will want to speak again. Thank you. The plant safety and security in the TVA document that was sent out back in 2010 says that severe accidents are defined as accidents with substantial damage to the reactor core and degradation of containment systems. Because the probability of a severe accident is very low, the NRC considers them too unlikely to warrant normal design controls to prevent or mitigate the consequences. Severe accident analyses consider both the risk of a severe accident and the off-site consequences. What that means is that they just dismiss out of hand the possibility of a severe accident and don't consider it at all in the environmental impact statement. Now, at Fukushima, 2 years ago, they had a severe accident. It was an accident that, and I was around the first time this plant was licensed, and we were promised that it wasn't possible to have that type of accident, that it was just impossible. And that was the words that were used on many occasions when those questions were raised. Now, at Fukushima, 160,000 people have been permanently evacuated from their homes. The cost is going to be anywhere from 50 to, I've seen figures as high as $500 billion of economic cost to Japan. I've seen figures that go up to around 11,000 square miles of land that is permanently contaminated for human use, evacuated. Farms, homes, businesses. So that's the kind of thing that a severe accident actually has done 2 years ago, and that accident is ongoing. They've still not got it under control, and there are serious issues with the fuel that's, the irradiated fuel that's in the fuel pools there, and we have a lot of irradiated fuel at Sequoyah. Every single bit of it that's been there since the beginning, that's been made there, is still there, much of it in fuel pools. At Chernobyl, 200,000 people were evacuated, and the amount of deaths are anywhere from 4,000 to 1 million, depending on who you ask. And the million is actually quite well documented by Ukrainian doctors, the people that are most likely to know. They evacuated permanently a 19-mile circle around with Chernobyl in the center. So just imagine, take a 19-mile circle from Sequoyah, and that's what's possible in the event of a severe accident, and that is not even being considered in this process. And I asked the NRC, in going through this in a post-Fukushima time, to take that into account in the decision to relicense or not. How much time do I have?
Minute 45 seconds.
Okay. The other issue I think that is important that I'll get into right now, if I can find my note, is this issue about the life expectancy. I have an AP article that was just written in the last year. I remember when these, as I said, these plants were first licensed, they said 40 years was it. The engineers that designed these things designed them for 40 years. Adding another 20 years is really suspect, and it's largely an economic decision. This article says they're rewriting history, saying that these things can go easily another 20 years. The metal embrittlement is a question. Just the design. I think later I'll get into the design of the ice condenser units, which are remarkable, except they're really wacky. I mean, you've got a lot of ice in there, but the ice condenser design, just briefly, was identified after a 3-mile island as being the most likely of all the United States reactors for the containment to fail in a serious accident, in a loss of coolant water accident where the fuel rods are exposed and you get hydrogen buildup. They had to go back and retrofit hydrogen igniters. But this design was done in the 60s. There's a reason why only 9 of these were built, 10 if you count Watts Bar 2. There's a reason why they're less than 10% of the United States reactor fleet, and why not a single new one has been built. TVA did finish the ones at Watts Bar that they had started. Thank you. And for the record, I don't see why we can't go on a little longer at first, but thank you, and I'd like to speak again. Once again, thanks for the opportunity. Before I get started, I'd like to recommend to everybody, especially the young people working on the NRC on this project. It's called Tritium on Ice. It gives a great history of the NRC, not totally, but in regard to the ice condenser design and the tritium question. And this man worked at the Sandia Lab for 25 years. He was highly respected until the truth finally got to him, especially on this particular issue. And in here, he says that there are serious grounds for worry that ice condenser plants could undergo catastrophic accidents, exposing nearby populations to fatal doses of radioactivity. And he goes on to say, this is a dispassionate outside observer, the fact that the operator of the plants is the Tennessee Valley Authority, a federal agency with a long history of compromising nuclear safety, exacerbates the potential danger. Now, the history of TVA and nuclear is long, and it's not so pretty. And we've been very lucky that we haven't had a major accident. Brown's Ferry almost went up because of the famous Campbell fire in 1974, and if you don't know about it, you should look it up, because it's pretty scary. There have been improvements, but his main point in here is that the ice condenser design is fundamentally flawed from the get-go. It was originally designed as a way to make the containment vessel less robust, not as thick, not as strong, not as big. So it costs less. This is nuclear power on the cheap. That's not the kind of nuclear power that we really want. We don't want any nuclear power, but on the cheap is the worst. That's why he says it's more likely to fail. The description of the ice condenser system is very well done by Dave Lockbaum in his book. The ice condenser is a large vault-like structure which encircles the base of the reactor containment building. The ice condenser is subdivided into 24 bays. Each bay has 2 hinged doors at the bottom of the wall between the reactor containment building and the ice condenser. Each bay contains 81 large, 45-foot tall baskets filled with ice. Those doors, in a major accident, those doors are supposed to open. The ice is supposed to absorb the heat. It's supposed to be chipped ice, and I would like to ask the resident inspector of the NRC, maybe privately or maybe publicly, to establish whether that ice stays chipped or whether it becomes solid blocks of ice, and how they've dealt with the subsidence issue, but not on my 10 minutes here, please. The other major issue, it's been mentioned about the children. In doing research on this, in a Reuters article from March 15, 2011, it said between 12,000 and 83,000 children were born with congenital deformities, according to the German physicians group IPPNW. Between 12 and 83,000 children born with deformities. Some of the deformities of these children, if you have the stomach for it, they're horrible. They're hardly human. Chernobyl, I'm sorry. Chernobyl. What did I say? Yeah, Chernobyl. Anyway, yeah, Chernobyl. So that's going back there. The other thing that I would like, next thing I'd like the NRC to consider in this application is the need for the power from this risky type of power. Last year alone, in 2012, according to USA Today, there was over 13,000 megawatts of wind power installed in the United States. That's 13 reactors like Sequoyah in 1 year, without hearings like this, without the need to go through these types of procedures, without the risk to the public, without the evacuation plans, without the radioactive waste. At Sequoyah, there is currently 1,174 metric tons of this high-level radioactive waste. It's easily 1 to 3 million times more radioactive than when the fuel went into the reactors. This is not just spent fuel. This stuff is a nightmare. At Fukushima Unit 4, which is teetering, and if it falls, there are concerns by scientists that it will be a global environmental catastrophe if that Unit 4, if all the cesium in there spills and is spread. Well, the amount of cesium, amount of fuel rods in that pool is far less than the 796 metric tons in the pools at Sequoyah right now. There's also 378 metric tons in casks there. So back to the need for it, the wind potential, the solar potential in the valley. At this point, TVA is putting a restriction on the amount of solar that can be installed. There's so much more potential to install solar, and it won't even cost TVA anything but the feed-in tariff. People are willing to spend their own money, put these solar panels on their roofs, and TVA is putting a limit on how much solar power can go on people's roofs. I think it's to justify continuing to build Watts Bar 2, continuing to operate Sequoyah, doing the small modular reactors. They're doing everything they can to slow down the renewables. And there are credible sources. The National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado, it's a Department of Energy funded think tank on renewable energy. It says we can get all of our power in a reliable grid by 2040, or 80% of our power in a reliable grid by 2040 from all renewable sources. And that's without even evolving the renewable technology like it's going to evolve. We don't need this plant. We need to get away from it. They're doing it in Germany. After Fukushima, the Germans decided to shut down all of their nuclear plants. They're going to do it by 2020 when this license is set to extend the life another 20 years. Certainly we can make plans and get rid of it. In Japan, after Fukushima, they have maybe one reactor operating. They had to go cold turkey off of nuclear because the people won't accept it anymore after they've seen the cost. So we should have a phase out at least, and the beginning of the phase out is to stop relicensing these old plants that have a much higher likelihood of problems, especially these ice condenser designs. The idea of putting MOX in this reactor, which is under consideration, TVA is the only utility that's thinking about using it, is phenomenally ridiculous. And this was tried in 2 ice condensers that Duke Power owns, and those experiments failed, and Duke Power ran away from it screaming. They won't touch the stuff, and TVA now is the only utility that's even considering it. So waste confidence, the waste, it was supposed to already be somewhere else. In the very beginning, they said, oh, don't worry about the waste. And there have been so many different ways to deal with it theoretically, but the reality is it's an almost insoluble problem that nowhere in the world have they really answered. Reprocessing is an environmental nightmare. Ask the people in West Valley, New York, where they tried reprocessing, and this was years and years ago, 20 or 30 years ago, and they're still cleaning up the mess. The DOE is still cleaning up the mess, and there's a plume of radioactive water that's headed to the Great Lakes underground, and it's an environmental nightmare for the people. This licensing procedure can't even be finished until the NRC figures out what to do with the waste. They did something called waste confidence. They said, trust us, we have confidence, we'll figure out what to do with the waste. Some of the independent environmental groups took the NRC to court and actually won, and the court said, you got to have a plan. And that process is going on concurrently with this process. I think the feeling is that the NRC, oh, we'll get the waste confidence thing done, and we'll get the Sequoyah thing done, and they'll all go together. But they can't relicense this plant until that waste is adequately addressed. And there are a lot of plans to do that, but some of the best minds in the world have been trying to figure that out for 50 years and have not figured it out. It's a nightmare of stew of toxic substances that absolutely have to be protected from the biosphere, and we are not doing a good job of that, and that's why the background radiation levels are increasing. If you want to find out more about the ice condenser design, again, for the NRC, please read New Reg 1150. That was something that was developed in the 1980s after 3 Mile Island, when there was a very serious attempt at the NRC to study the reactors, and that's where the ice condensers came out as the very most likely to fail, and that again was a study conducted by the NRC. And it needs to be part of the debate about whether this reactor should continue. It should have been part of the debate about Watts Bar 2 and the licensing there. But I believe that there's a renewed interest by the people of the country and also at the NRC in safety because of the tragedy at Fukushima. And I trust that that spirit will infuse this process, that it is a fact that not one of these license renewal process applications has been denied, and people have called it rubber stamp. I hope that the rubber stamping stops and this will be a very serious consideration, and thank you.